Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to another special edition of Friday Drinks. It's great to be here, and thanks to Pro Brands, they've made the bar very colorful. Lots of food, lots of drinks. Pro Brands. Ranga, what's happening? Tell us.
Well, look, it's another Friday, fantastic one, where we are supported again by our friends in the corporate world. That's what we've always wanted to do. So it's not just Pro Brands. So we've got Pro Brands, obviously, for us non-drinkers. But there's a very special wine that has been sponsored again by another interesting partner of ours. And I'll let Faro speak to us about that. But look, it's good. We have got the drink, some eats. And lots of groceries. So, yeah, some, mayonnaise.
Yeah, the teetotalers are happy and
Yeah, we're happy. I mean,
grinning like Chelsea candles.
exactly what we look forward to.
Remember, there was a time, Tinashe, when guys would just come with a bottle of whiskey. And they're just giving it to this guy and George.
Totally, and totally forget about us.
Exactly.
Yeah, think about it. A revived dairy fruit mix. Orange, that's what I'm going to have. Yeah. No preservatives, which is actually fantastic. It's healthy. Snacks as well. They're treating as well.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. It's good.
Yeah, and it's a great brand, actually.
You've done a decent job.
Thank you very much.
The sponsors are finally recognizing the teetotalers.
I
haven't had that problem.
2 years later.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And okay, so tell us a little bit about the wine that you have.
Okay, so my friend Munashe is a young entrepreneur, and he's involved in a wine distributor called Ashirai Distributors. And so he's gifted me this bottle of Tumbanga Pinotage. That's, their signature brand. Apparently this Pinotage is their best-selling wine in Zim at the moment. And so, I hear the Tumbanga is basically named after a gold and copper alloy. So I'm going to be trying this for the first time today. I've heard nothing but good things, and I'm quite stoked about trying this, especially on a nippy Friday afternoon. Red wine is
it nippy?
No, it is quite nippy. You guys were layered in jerseys.
No, you were.
No, Ranga was.
Ranga was. No, it's actually mid-June.
I always want to take precaution because it's winter.
Because he's of a weak constitution.
Whatever, man.
So yeah,
it's actually good. This is my first time actually having this.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's actually very good. Yeah, let us know in the comment section if you actually like Revive Orange. I certainly like it, just the taste, and I like the fact that it has no preservatives.
Yeah, certainly.
So yeah, and support us by supporting Revive Daily Fruit Mix, and they've got different. What are you having? Orange.
I'm also having the orange, but I think here there's the peach and apricot from this big box.
Passion fruit?
Yes.
Quite a bit. Yeah. I've had their rice.
Okay.
It's actually okay. It's very good.
Have
you had any of their products?
Yeah, certainly. I've interacted with it from at some point. Yeah. So, and Faro, on your side, so there's just the red one, or there's white and.
Well, they have a whole range. I think this is the most popular incarnation of it, and they do other brands. So it's called Ashirai Distributors, and I think you might see a pullback or some details on the video. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, you must let us know, how it actually tastes later on in the show, and we'll know whether it's potent or not.
Well,
I can usually tell.
30 minutes into the show.
Yeah. I can usually tell.
Yeah.
But
quite
today,
like it. Yeah.
Today is actually a special day for us because we want to talk all things Africa. There's a lot that's actually happening in Africa.
Do you identify as a Pan-Africanist?
Yeah, no, I do. I not that I identify. I identify as Tinashe. I'm not into
Pronouns.
Pronouns and group associations. I do identify as an individual, but I do appreciate the Pan-African.
But is it a monolithic?
Okay, we'll get into the details, but first of all, I just need to introduce what we're actually going to talk about. So we want to talk about South Africa and what is actually happening in South Africa and the Government of National Unity, and more specifically, the impact on Zim and the rest of Africa, if at all it has an impact. Then I also wanted us to talk about Kenya and what's actually happening in Kenya. And the more interesting thing about Kenya is whether or not what Ruto is trying to do is good or bad thing. You know, we've got these Gen Z that are out on the streets and protesting against the finance bill. Is that the right thing? Do we identify with Gen Z or do we identify with the older folk like Ruto, who have to rule, who have to do something because the economy where it is, it's in a precarious position. But we'll get into those debates because I think that on a global scale, it gets into, I don't know if you guys followed the British politics and more specifically the Conservative, where you had Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. You know, they had divergent views on a very particular matter, which is government deficit. How do we get out of a deficit? And it was a very good conversation there. And I think it's also a relevant one in America, where suddenly you're settled with this heavy debt. Mm-hmm. How do you get out of that debt? And I think it's a conversation that we can have.
Oh, we also have debt issues here too.
That's what I mean. So if we zoom out and we talk about what's actually happening in Africa, maybe we can get into the ideological differences and also what Zimbabwe has to do. Does austerity actually work or it doesn't work? Those are some of the debates that we will do. And for Zim economy, we'll then get into what is actually happening in the economy. I think, the murmurs and what we're getting from business is that demand has waned quite substantially, whether in the formal sector or in the informal sector. They see a significant depression in demand and sales or consumption actually lower than it was same time last year. Will that have an impact? Is that because of the drought? Is that because of the ZIG? Will it have an impact? So those are the things that we'll talk about, and I think that it'll be an exciting show. So I'm going to give this to Ranga because, you've been away for a while, and it'll be interesting to hear just your views on South Africa and what happened in South Africa. Is that a good thing? And then what do you think the impact will be as far as the economy is concerned?
It's a good thing. I remember when we were having a private discussion some other time over lunch. I think it was just a day after the results or as the results were coming through. And one thing that I picked was there was an interview on one of the TV channels featuring one of the senior executives of ANC. I don't know if that's the term they use, an equivalent of the Politburo. And this was way before the elections. Yes, the election results had been confirmed. And the reporter was actually pushing hard to say, you know what, the ANC is in trouble and that kind of thing. And this politician was saying, no, this is actually the will of the people. They went on to ask him whether they were going to get into some sort of a coalition. They said, it's not we want or otherwise, it's what the people want. So the ANC as a player will just look at the results and say, okay, if people say they want this kind of proportion in terms of how the politics of the country should be structured, then we have to go by it. I found it very refreshing coming from an African politician, especially the one who was representing the ruling party at the time, because it's very rare in the African context because
the Liberation Party.
It was more like a concession speech before the actual results. It's very, very rare. And in fact, it's not just only in Africa, but where there's contestation for power, people always try to, even when it's clear that the tide is actually shifting against them, they want to give this picture that they are still in control and they will remain in power. So I think that was, for me, that was a very interesting sort of turning point in terms of my views on the South African politics. Now I remember we were then discussing or sort of debating about what's the likely and most sort of beneficial kind of coalition if it was to happen. And on one end was ANC coming together with fellow African liberation sort of stalwarts, so MK and etc. And then there was DA, which at some point it looked like it was an impossible thing to do. But I think for me, having been in Zim and seeing all the effects of the economic challenges that I've had, my focus has always been which coalition, which grouping is going to be good for the economy. I was not emotional about any historical issues, any racial issues, because, I mean, I've learned that people could actually go into the most sort of segregative society as long as the economics is right. And here in Zimbabwe, we have been going to South Africa even during the time of apartheid. Why? Because the economy there was what? Was pumping. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, what is good for the people is actually something that is good for their livelihood, something that is good for the economy. And when you're looking right now at the performance of the rand since the results and the markets, they are telling you that the markets are actually, they're seeing this ANC, DA and other parties alliance as being positive for the economy. And I also feel that it was not an emotional kind of structure which was based on people's feelings or ideology, but I think it was very nationalistic in its stance, because they chose to do what was good for their country, even if at the expense of isolating themselves from their base. Because I suppose the ANC, typical ANC supporter would be like, how dare you teaming up with the erstwhile oppressors and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, it was
bread and butter
issues.
Okay, so The Economist, the publication The Economist, had a story on South Africa, and it was the headline was, "Maybe South Africa has something to teach the world about democracy." And my question to you, Rufaro, is do you hold this to be true? Because they looked at where democracy is across the globe, and they thought that this was a point of departure, a very positive point of departure, where South Africa is actually teaching the world what democracy means and a change of government, that somebody can be in a majority and also become a minority and move with the will of the people. What are your thoughts on that? Can South Africa actually teach the world about democracy, let alone Africa?
I think so. I think, look, if you look at the last 5 years, for example, the so-called bastions of democracy on the global stage, like the United States, for example, you had the losing candidate in a presidential election say that the election was stolen, refused to actually attend the inauguration. Right, something that's is typical of banana republics. So certainly, I think The Economist has a point in that maybe in the first world people take it for granted and they don't cherish it as much because they've had it for so long, and because they don't, and then they therefore regress, and pander or support these populists and demagogues who don't respect democracy. And whereas South Africa, relative to the developed world, it's actually a very young democracy. I think, democracy,
years.
And you have a ruling party that lost its majority and has behaved in a very gracious manner towards its opponents. And has embraced the will of the people, so I think they do have a point. I think we ought to take our hat off to them in terms of how they've conducted themselves. I mean, in terms of, on a typical day, there's much more violent crime in South Africa than in most parts of Africa. But you have this election where the ruling party loses, and it's not followed by an orgy of violence. So I think they've comported themselves admirably in the aftermath of an election in which the ruling party lost, in which the most populist radical voices didn't win as much as the vote as they would have liked, in which what is caricatured as a white
party,
minority, minority party that represents, the legacy of apartheid actually won. They actually grew their share of the vote. So it's.
But to be correct, the DA was a Liberal Party under apartheid. The NNP, the National Party under apartheid, actually joined the ANC post-apartheid, whereas the DA, I think its roots has always been Liberal.
Yeah, but which is why I was careful and used the term caricature, right? So caricature is not necessarily accurate,
True.
right? But opponents of the DA like to label them as if they were ardent supporters of apartheid and the oppression of blacks. But they've managed, and this is the beauty of politics, right? Because it's about getting your message out. And there are two competing or there are many competing messages, and then at the end of the day, you count the ballots, and the vote tells you what the people think.
Ranga, going with the theme, South Africa certainly has something to teach the rest of the world. What does South Africa teach the rest of Africa?
The biggest lesson is it's actually part of democracy to win or lose elections. So even if you are a ruling party, you are the sitting party at the time, and you are the one who is overseeing an election process, I should not be expecting to be the winner all the time. So democracy is saved when you lose. Democracy is saved when you win. And you can actually do it for the betterment of your country. I was just thinking about this scene in, I think, Julius Caesar, when I think Brutus was actually addressing the Senate, I think. And I'm sure people were looking at him and say, "You're a traitor. How do you do that to Caesar?" And said some very interesting statement that where he said, "Not that I love Caesar less, but I love Rome more."
The Republic.
Yes. So it's about the Republic. And I think that's the kind of message that I think I would sort of read from, say, the ANC and even from Ramaphosa, that it's not that his love for ANC and, the values that they represent, it doesn't hold them in high esteem. But I think, as far as they are concerned, South Africa is more important than their organizations.
You're being very poetic. What's happening?
It's very ironic that he's using Brutus, though, as a paragon of.
Well, he was. I actually
virtue.
Yeah, he was. He was virtuous.
No, he was just power hungry.
No. He was virtuous because Caesar was so brutal to the Republic, and we forget that Rome thrived as a republic, not as an empire. In fact, its troubles and how the Roman Empire actually ended is because of the reign of the emperors. And Julius Caesar brought forth
but it's not like
the tyranny.
Brutus wasn't a breath of fresh air. He
wasn't. No one is. We're not talking about it.
Exactly.
But I think that those words ring true. That the love for the Republic
is more important than the love for
a tyrant.
A tyrant, yeah.
Fair enough.
And for me, that's a true definition of patriotism, the love for your country. And I think that's another lesson that African countries or us as Africans can actually learn. That if we differ in terms of ideologies or the political parties that we follow and maybe the thinking, that does not make me less of a Zimbabwean. We still have got something in common, which is our country.
To carry on your poetic caricatures, you're still Roman.
Exactly.
You're still a citizen.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Can we now talk about the impact on the economy?
We could talk about Rome all day.
Indeed. But can we talk about the impact on the economy? So we know, we're not South African analysts, and people are not watching this show because they want to know what the economic impact is in South Africa. They're watching this show and wondering, what will the economic impact on Zimbabwe be? So, for example, and I've heard a lot of people asking these questions. We've seen the rand strengthening. That means, and as a trading partner, 40% of our trade actually comes from South Africa. It means that goods are going to be expensive than they were previously. Is that a good or bad thing? We also know that the largest investor in Zimbabwe is actually South Africa and South African companies. Now that they're wealthier and they're doing well, will they actually go across the border and invest more? What are your thoughts on the impact of the elections on Zimbabwe's economy?
So the way I look at it is it's more on the productive aspect of the economy and maybe less on the monetary aspect. So a thriving South Africa, it means because Zim will continue being reliant on South Africa economically. And a thriving South Africa means that Zim has got a partner that has got capacity to even do more. So it means people that are looking for jobs, people that are looking for opportunity.
Well, are you saying that more border jumpers?
No, not necessarily. Of course, border jumpers, but also even professionals. Because look at it this way: the level of unemployment and underemployment for professional people in Zimbabwe is quite high. And a South African economy that is pumping, where there's growth across all sectors, is actually good for
skilled labor.
Yeah, for skilled labor. But also, as they're seeing that growth, Zim could actually be a good, a viable option, even in terms of setting up their production facilities, but also as a market. So even the South Africans will find it worth a while to invest more into this country. But it also serves as it always done, as a beacon, as a benchmark in terms of what we need to aspire to as a country in terms of our economics.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it, that actually, all said and done, maybe South Africa is a beacon, an example. It sets an example. So we're always then judged against that example. So if you're looking at foreign investors who might have not been necessarily keen on South Africa over the last 5 years, are now looking at South Africa more prominently than Zimbabwe. Because then they will say, but what's wrong with you when across the border they're doing things right? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, look, I think that's true, for sure. I think South Africa certainly sets an example for us. But I think what will probably have a bigger impact on Zim, I could be wrong, but my sense is that just looking at some of the reporting coming out of the major global financial hubs, the big banks are talking about looking at South Africa differently, in terms of their weighting, in terms of their propensity to allocate capital to South Africa. And you've got to look at, when you look at, Johannesburg, it is basically Africa's financial hub. And if you see more flows into that part of the world, guys flying down to Joburg from Europe, Asia, and the US, looking for deals, they're much more likely. One of the spillover effects of that interest is that they're going to say, hey, because Harare is an hour 30 minutes out of Joburg. The rest of Africa, you can reach quite easily out of Joburg. And the chances are that somebody who's going to do deals in South Africa is going to say, hey, is going to have a conversation with somebody that says, look, check out this asset in Zimbabwe. It might also be worth your while. I think, there'll be that spillover. Do
you honestly believe that?
Yeah, I think there'll certainly be a spillover where people, who would never...
asset allocator, because, a lot of the asset allocation is done by machines, right? And if you think about it, an asset allocator who's sitting in New York, and they look at South Africa and they think, there's this box that they need to tick, which is democracy and change of government and institutions, rule of law. It has ticked all those boxes and then allocates money into South Africa. And you're saying that same person will then look at Zimbabwe and think, I might as well invest in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, look, so I don't think it's as simple as you've put it. So I'll use an anecdote, but I think it's scalable, right? So a guy who wasn't looking at South Africa sees a report from JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs saying, look, you need to allocate some capital to that part of the world. We think there's some alpha there, right? And they say, okay, fine, this wasn't on my radar. Let me go down there and see what the opportunities are. And you're in Joburg, you have a bunch of meetings, You spend a bit of time trying to understand things there. Then somebody says, you know what, why don't you check out the Vic Falls? Or go over to Minor Falls. It's beautiful. It's amazing. Right? And you inadvertently spend some time in Zim. Right? Even if you weren't actually ostensibly looking for any investment opportunities. That wasn't really... But you're in this part of the world anyway, right? It's a, 16-hour flight from New York to Joburg, right? If you can check out the Vic Falls or some interesting things, north of the Limpopo, you might, some of them will be given to doing that. And it will shape their perception of this country, because I think one of the realities that we need to be honest about when it comes to Zim is that the perception is awful out there, right? And a lot of people have never actually set foot here. They don't know what it's like. And so they'll come across, and I think actually being here on the ground, notwithstanding everything that's not working, I think you will come away with a better perception than
Rufaro, I think you're clutching your straws, yeah. I tend to believe what Ranga was saying, which is an expanded industry in South Africa. A lot of the businesses in South Africa, when they start receiving this capital from international bodies or their own capital, because this is another aspect that people forget, that actually the South African economy, there's a lot of capital that's just lying idle, that hasn't been invested, that these same companies do have subsidiaries in Zimbabwe. And if they have bigger balance sheets, then they might be the ones willing to cross the Limpopo and come into Zimbabwe. So if you look at the mining companies, if you are an Implats or whoever who's sitting in South Africa and suddenly you're awash with cash and your balance sheet has increased, but you know Zim and you know that there are assets in Zim that could actually help you with your alpha, then you're willing to invest more. And we know that there are a lot of Zimbabwean companies that actually get capital from South Africa. So your credit lines that are coming directly from South Africa. And if South Africa starts lending, then there might be spillover.
So also even portfolio investments. Yeah. Remember what was happening in 2009. Although the actual destinations of the monies that was coming into Zim maybe was probably in Western Europe and maybe North America, it was actually coming into SA first. So as capital is flowing into South Africa, I think there's obviously a likelihood that someone like, like we're saying, we are here. We are excited about South Africa. What's happening in the neighboring? What else is there? So maybe, what if I allocate just 2% of my Africa allocation or Pan-Africa allocation to this country as an experiment? So a thriving South Africa is actually very good for us.
So remember,
okay, gentlemen,
BlackRock set up an office in Joburg, and then they shut it down, right? Because I think at the time, they had a minimum deal size of about 50 million, and South Africa was looking bleak. The rest of Africa wasn't looking that much better. And they just shut down the office. They said, you know what, this is too hard.
Right? It's too small, not too hard.
Yeah, but it's just too small. So now that they've changed their global macroeconomic view of South Africa, they'll say, okay, you know what, let's set up an office again in Joburg, put 500 million there, right? And like Ranga's rightly pointed out, they might allocate a small portion of that to the rest of Africa, to smaller. So we will, we're that guy who's going to get some of the crumbs.
Byproduct, some of the crumbs. But, we're also competing with Botswana. We're competing with Mozambique. That's looking extremely good at this particular point in time. You got Zambia. You got Namibia. People forget this, that Namibia right now is a thriving economy.
Yeah, they'll speak for themselves. We are speaking for Zimbabwe. We are being selfish.
Yeah. But what are we then selling?
Yeah.
What are you selling?
So you're very right that it doesn't necessarily mean that even if South Africa is awash with capital, that capital will just find its way into Zim without us having to do anything. But I don't know from the way you planned the discussion if you're going to maybe just give room to just discuss briefly the sort of political implications. I would say what has happened.
You seem keen on it, so
yes.
Please go ahead.
So I would say another big lesson is I think the African leaders need to know that there's a very direct positive correlation between the politics, how you do your politics, and the economics. like what you're seeing right now with the markets cheering up the South African elections and also with the rand. This is a political process that happened or that was done in a way which the market generally felt that was progressive. And because of that, the political actors are being rewarded with some positive sort of movements and sentiments in the market.
The rand is strengthened.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's a big lesson for everyone that is following and watching the South African politics to know that, you know what, if you do your politics right,
your economics
will certainly benefit from
so
it.
let's segue a bit and let's talk about the risks. So we've got this coalition, whether you call it a government or national unit or a coalition with the DA. But what are the risks that, let's suppose this thing doesn't work, right? Mm-hmm. We've got 5 years, but it works for 2 years or whatever, and it's disbanded. What are the risks? How will that impact the rest of Africa, and more specifically Zimbabwe?
Yeah, so I'm just going to look at it through a very economic lens. Just to get into a bit more detail in terms of what Ranga had alluded to, I think what the uncertainty that this coalition has taken away from an economic policy standpoint is that the EFF and MK are associated with expropriation policies, expropriation of land, expropriation of minerals, which is bad for business. Right, and ahead of the election, it was uncertain what the outcome would be and what kind of coalition would lead, and whether it would involve these parties with this, what they call it a radical transformation agenda. Right. So from a policy standpoint, the ANC-DA coalition or GNU, whatever you want to call it, it's telling the market that we are not going to pursue radical economic transformation. We're going to be business friendly. Right, and I think that's the key takeaway. That's why the rand has strengthened, and that's why the sentiment from foreign investors has improved. And I think that's the takeaway from us, because notwithstanding that,
So suppose it goes horribly wrong.
Well, then, I think the results are predictable. The rand will tank. People were talking about the rand going to 30 if the election results weren't business friendly. And, that all these investors that are looking at South Africa as a destination for their capital will simply pull their capital. The markets are very brutal in terms of the way they look at risk and return. If the risk and return matrix makes sense, then capital flows into that place. If it stops making sense for whatever reason, so
there's an argument on the left that you guys tend to be apoplectic, that the sky will fall if the EFF and the MK get into bed with the ANC. That maybe that will not be so. They're not going to be as radical as they say. When you're in opposition, you have to be radical because you have to radicalize and ensure that ensure that your base is well excited. But once you're in government, and the ANC has seen this, you still need to deliver. And the number one thing that you need to deliver is jobs. From an economic perspective, unemployment in South Africa is about 40%. Youth unemployment is closer to 65%. So those are real issues that I don't think that the EFF or the NK would implement if they were in government. So this idea that without the DA, South Africa will collapse. Are we not?
No, I never made such a claim. I never made such a claim. I simply pointed out
markets will be brutal.
Yeah. I simply pointed out that because if you actually look at EFF's economic agenda, if you look at MK's economic agenda, it's not pro-business, right? Just putting it charitably. Okay. So if I'm sitting on the fence and I want to understand what the economic policy is going to be over the next 5 years, and somebody with a manifesto like EFF's is in power, I'm less likely to invest in that market, right? Because I could wake up tomorrow and, my investment has been expropriated by the state.
Okay. So that's the danger that we have. You're more amenable and friendlier to the EFF and to the MK. Am I right in characterizing you that way? And so suppose there's this big risk and it plays out that it fractures the coalition between the DA and the ANC. And suddenly the ANC is found in bed with EFF and the MK. do you think that the sky is going to fall, or maybe not the sky, but markets will be, very brutal with that coalition?
Well, it would depend on the source of the conflict. So let's suppose that they are differing in terms of the economic policy to pursue. Maybe someone in the ANC is saying, no, we want to pursue the land reform because that's the reason why we lost an election. And then the DA is saying no, or maybe the way you want to do it will scare away investors and that kind of thing. So this is a purely economic sort of difference, and there is a disintegration in the coalition on that basis. And the ANC is signaling that they are better off with a partner that will just comes up and, you start taking land and those kind of things. Surely that will be a problem. But if maybe the differences are more political, if they are fighting over some issues that are not related to economics, and maybe over the period that they would have worked together, they have actually demonstrated. Because, the thing with the coalition is, there will be some people in the ANC that will probably benefit from that pro-business kind of stance, right? And if there are any accusation against, say, the DA, maybe you say they are not they are not as nationalistic. There's probably someone within that DA that will sort of catch on, or that will rub onto some of the people. So it's possible for some people from the different sides to sort of borrow certain qualities. So it might actually be good for the ANC. We might actually see an ANC that reforms, and
then eventually actually gets more votes.
Because you see,
but we're talking about the risk.
Yeah.
So I think that the positives are we've laid out the positives, but all we wanted to do was to make our audience
so
aware
if it doesn't
that there
work,
are risks.
If it doesn't work, the ANC will still have an option to do another coalition with MK and EFF, and I actually think it might
coalition of doom.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I think pretty much everyone. Look, I liked Malema's speech in Parliament.
Very conciliatory.
Yes, very conciliatory. And he was saying, no, we're going to work to support you. And to the speaker, we just know that you're not just the speaker for the ANC and etc. That's progress, eh? It's
or he's just being Machiavellian and is making it known to the ANC that if things don't work out with the DA,
then
we're there.
That's good. So that on its own is actually a massive transformation.
Okay.
Because look at the Malema of the previous parliament and Malema of this new parliament.
He would have been a rabble rouser, but now
exactly.
he's acting.
He's mellow and he's not as combative as he used to be, and his views towards the ANC and the DA is one that says, no, we are brothers and sisters.
Okay.
We all want the same thing.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for this. To the audience, I think it's quite clear. Good news coming out of South Africa, but we always need to be aware of the risk that this coalition could fracture, and if it does fracture, then the alternative is not as rosy. So we just need to be aware.
Why are you saying it's not as rosy? Are you already making a judgment call on MK and EFF? No.
I'm not. I've actually been very tempered, but I think I tend to agree with Rufaro that it is a coalition of doom. Because their policies are, it's a radical economic transformation, and we know what that means. It's
a euphemism for destruction.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to be very clear that if that happens, then I think it will be quite destructive.
I want to make it very clear that I disagree with Tinashe and Rufaro. Where I agree with you, which is actually the position that I hold from day one, was of before the coalition, I actually preferred an ANC DNA. Purely from an economic business point of view. I remember we had the main discussion at the conference, remember?
Yeah.
And then someone like, it's not going to work, it's not good for the history of the country. And I'm not emotional about the history of the country given what I've experienced. I'm emotional about bread and butter issues.
Absolutely, and we hope so. And on bread and butter issues, let's go to Nairobi. You know, there was a bill that was tabled within Parliament, Finance Bill 2024, and before it was passed, Gen Z, was on the street and protesting. So just to give context, what is actually happening is the raft of policies that have been introduced in the finance bill, really bordering on austerity, so raising taxes, so that you can cover the deficit. And the deficit is defined as the difference between expenditure and revenue. And the government debt and the deficit has been growing quite substantially, especially in a lot of African countries. Ghana is suffering from the same problem. Zambia is suffering from the same problem. And so was Kenya. And what we saw before Ruto take hold of government was that the deficit had increased to somewhere around 5.7, closer to 6% of the budget. And what had happened is Ruto came in and he had a raft of measures that saw the Kenyan shilling actually gaining. So it moved from 160. You know, last year when we were in Nairobi, it was closer to 160, and now it's closer to 120, 125, 128. And he has been doing the right things. But unfortunately, he has introduced a very bad word. You must
qualify that and say, you think he's been doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think he's been doing the right thing. But austerity and how to cover
I'm not a fan of austerity.
Deficit is quite problematic. And that's what I want us to discuss. So the first thing is I want it to be ideological before we get into what the problem is in Kenya. And the ideological argument is this. You inherit a government that is settled in debt and government deficit. And you're unable to pay your foreign creditors as well as your local creditors. Inflation is high. Interest rates are high. Just the interest burden on your interest on your debt is so high, higher than your economic growth. So what that means is you're effectively in a debt trap. And you inherit a government like that. What do you do?
So philosophically, as a libertarian, the solution is really quite simple. You cut spending, you reduce the size of government, everything that government really ought not to be doing, you hive it off to the private sector, and you cut regulations, you make the environment much more easier for businesses to navigate and do business in, and you also cut taxes. So that as an investment destination, you
actually increase the deficit. Because when you cut taxes, and so number one, when you cut expenditure or cut government expenditure, it's not going to be immediate. The benefit, you will probably see it in year 3, year 4, right?
Why won't it be immediate?
Because there's an increase in retrenchment costs. So if you retrench a number of civil servants, immediately what happens is you've got retrenchment costs. So the immediate effect is you increase your deficit.
So what tends to happen in a lot of countries is that your biggest costs aren't actually salaries and wages. It's unsustainable subsidies, right? Because these tend to be popular. You want to protect society's weakest and most vulnerable. So there's a subsidy for everything that the weakest, society's least and most vulnerable consume. There's a subsidy on grain, on fuel.
So that's exactly what Ruto did.
So you just remove that. And
when he came on, that's the first thing he did. So he slashed and removed all the subsidies.
And then your excess headcount.
And this is what Malawi couldn't do, Zambia couldn't do. They couldn't cut the subsidies, but Ruto comes in, and that's the first thing he does. He removes all the subsidies, but there's still a problem.
You remove the subsidies.
Yep, remove the subsidies.
And then you have all this red tape and regulation that just makes it incredibly difficult for people to, for capital formation, for people to start businesses, for people to run their businesses. So you need to cut that.
But that doesn't. It's a good thing, but it has no impact on our fiscus.
Not in year one, right?
Exactly. That's what I mean. But because you've got an immediate problem. The immediate problem is tomorrow, by the end of this budgetary session, is our budget's deficit has actually increased.
Yeah,
and all our creditors are worried.
Yeah, and creditors are reasonable people. I think if you have a vision to move the country forward, there's nothing stopping you from sitting down with the creditors and saying, look guys, as you can see, it's a mess, right? And the thing about national debt in most instances is that
this is actually good. Right.
It is.
Well done.
The detail is in the public domain, right? You know, so the fact that you and I are having this conversation means all the creditors and potential creditors know exactly what kind of problems the Kenyan government is in, right? So there's absolutely nothing stopping them from having a conversation saying, look guys, this is where we are. Okay.
Actually, in the last 6 months, let's hear what Ranga says. But before we do that, in the last 6 months, that's exactly what Ruto did. He went to America, he went to Europe, and they said, yeah, fine, great. We'll restructure, we'll give you even more debt. The US has given more debt. Eurobond, he released a new Eurobond. It was subscribed, but all those creditors came with their conditions. And now he has to implement those conditions. And unfortunately, the public is not hearing it. What would you do? You've got a deficit, you inherit a deficit, and you have to close the deficit immediately in year 1, not what happens in year 3, year 4. Now, if you cut expenditure, which is a great thing, the impact you only feel it in year 3, year 4. Year 1, there's actually an increase because you have to retrench people, so you have to actually spend a lot more. What do you do year 1?
Yeah. I've got issues with austerity programs, especially in poor African countries. They don't work. They don't work. The economic structural programs that IMF tried to impose on poor, mostly African countries, they just don't work because you are cutting all those things on a society that is already in trouble. So people are living below the poverty atom line. There's not enough. There are food security issues. You've got a youthful population looking for jobs, and things are just not working. So it's different from maybe an austerity in a fairly rich country where people have got some savings and they've got some fallbacks. So I know it looks good when you put it in some economic model, but I doubt it's practical in a young nation with
Ranga. Tendai Biti, when he was in government, he came up with the phrase, you eat what we kill. Right? That's austerity.
No, that wasn't austerity. So
how's that not austerity?
Back. You know,
how is that not austerity?
I think we give him far too much credit, right?
Okay, but first of all, explain how that is not austerity. You eat what you kill.
No,
you don't have a deficit.
You see, he didn't have the option of having a deficit. You see, it's kind of,
that's very true.
So it's not like he could have been profligate and
he chose to be,
run a significant deficit, and then out of discipline decided that wasn't okay and went for austerity. No. The money just wasn't there. Remember the first few months of the GNU, the government wasn't even paying civil servants cash salaries. They're giving them IOUs, pieces of paper that they could redeem in supermarkets, right? The government was that broke, right? So, it's easy with the benefit of hindsight to say, oh yeah, that was brilliant. Eat what you kill. But anyone running the ministry at that time didn't have an alternative, right? So
you're saying Tuli as an alternative? You're saying Chinamasa as an alternative?
To the extent that they were able to print, to the extent that they were able to borrow, they had an alternative.
But BT could have printed as well.
No, he couldn't. We were dollarized. Remember, people had completely lost faith.
Chinamasa were dollarized.
But it was way into dollar. I think what Faro is saying, which I tend to agree with, is so we were just getting into dollarization. So even if BT wanted to be reckless, to overspend, we didn't have the money to spend. Okay. And these are US dollars. We could not. We are not.
So how's it different from Ruto, who's saying we don't have money to spend?
No, so actually, we need to give him credit, right? Because the market share of the shilling in the Kenyan economy is close to 100%. In fact, it's hard for you to actually transact anywhere in Kenya outside a bank with US dollars, right? The average man on the street, small, medium enterprise, corporate, everything is priced in shillings, and there isn't really scope for you to transact in in our currency. So if he wanted to operate with wanton recklessness, he actually has the option to just print. So we've got to give him kudos for actually saying, you know what, guys, I'm not going to take that path. I'm going to actually, to the extent that I need to raise money that I don't have, I'm going to do it through the front door. I'm going to declare, I'm going to go to my creditors, I'm going to raise euro bonds, I'm going to raise US denominated debt. I'm going to go into the domestic market and convince people with capital to lend it to me. Right. So
and they have their conditions.
Exactly. So we've got to give them credit, right? They have the option to print, and they've closed the door.
And he knows the consequences of printing.
So kudos to him so we can give him credit for being disciplined and not printing.
So the point I actually wanted to make to you guys is this, that the reality is Kenya, for all its problems, has never had structural adjustment programs. They've always managed to get around the problem. And we can see it now, because what Ruto is doing is what Kibaki had to do before when he inherited a comatose economy. And because if you compare what's happening in Nairobi and you compare it with what's happening in Accra, in Ghana, they're headed towards another structural adjustment program. Zambia is headed towards a structural adjustment program. And Ruto is actually doing the right thing, where he's saying, guys, if we don't do this, then the IMF in 5 years' time is going to impose a structural adjustment program. Because then we're going to go to our creditors and say, you know what? We've blown up and we have no way of getting around this. And he's saying immediately, I've done all the right things, but the rot was so much. What people don't realize about Kenyatta is while he was a populist and he was popular, but he was just not the best manager of the economy. And the rot was just too much. And this guy is coming in and he's saying, okay, I'm going to raise taxes, especially indirect taxes. Whenever you raise indirect taxes, it just means that you need money immediately, because it's not sustainable. And that's why I actually agree with you that increasing taxes is actually not the way to go about it. I think austerity is good. Increasing taxes must just be a temporary measure. And I think that this is where he has failed in his messaging. To say, guys, we're increasing taxes because we need to service our loans. Because if we don't service our loans today, the pain, the medicine that we have to take today, in 5 years' time, it will be imposed on us by IMF. And when the IMF imposes, it's going to be a long haul. It's going to be 10, 20 years to get out of that. And you get into a vicious cycle.
I differ with you there. I think
go ahead.
Look, I'm vexed that politicians don't get this, because cutting is never popular, right? And I can understand a politician thinking about the next election and how being unpopular might not be the most useful position to be in, right? So they would naturally be reticent to cut or do anything that's unpopular. But I can't understand how economic growth can be unpopular, right? If you cut taxes, if you reduce regulations, right, you make it really attractive for investors to come into the country and build businesses and create jobs, right? Yes, the deficit will grow in the short term, right? But you have a conversation with your creditors where you say, listen, guys, this is actually the only sustainable path for us to get out of this hole that we're in, right? If we push austerity too much, we're going to have people in the streets. So right now it's just Gen Z. You do austerity at a harsh enough level, everybody will go on the street, right? Yeah. So as a politician, you then explain to the creditors that, look, austerity is not going to work. It's deeply unpopular. There'll be social unrest. First prize is growth, right? Because when there's strong economic growth, the deficit, even without government spending...
Did austerity work in Greece?
Well, we can go down that rabbit hole, because I'm not going to say yes.
Okay.
So the other thing that I also have a big problem with, or maybe that's the way central governance is done, is this whole issue of imposing. So it's a major decision that has to be made. I don't know if you believe that, you say it's socialist, they believe that government is some sort of a social contract between the ruled and the rulers, right? the electors and the elected. So you want to pursue such a very, life-changing kind of path. Isn't there merit in, so in this case, President Ruto to sort of engage, to canvass for ideas, and even communicate, the actual communication of what they are trying to do, what they are trying to achieve. And also just to go, just look at that expenditure bill and say, these are the line items. Maybe they are 30, they are 25. And say, okay, fine. Maybe to try and share the burden, if it's possible. Because, you see, what will surprise you with African countries is, so probably he would increase taxes, so bread is now expensive. That was one of the issues that...
it's consumptive. So
yeah.
The taxes that they've increased are consumptive tax. It's not investment tax.
Yes.
It's anything that has to do with consumption.
So you see, so they are increasing consumptive tax, but there are certain aspects of the economy that are spared, and I wouldn't be surprised if even government expenditure, I mean things that are directly going to bureaucracies in government, people who are running it, there are no changes. So pretty much Ruto and his colleagues are still enjoying their lofty kind of lifestyle. That would be unfair.
That reminds me of a very interesting
that would be unfair. So I think whenever I would say whenever such a life-changing kind of policy has to be pursued, I think they need to look at it in
consensus.
a consensus in a holistic way,
right.
and there should be equality.
The cut must cut
exactly.
across. You know what? I tend to agree with you, Ranga, that the messaging has been terrible. Has been horrible. And I will put it in what happened with Liz Truss. What Liz Truss was trying to do in the UK was actually right, but they got the messaging wrong. And the messaging was terrible.
Or like the Zig.
Well, fundamentally, Zig has a problem. So it's actually quite different from. Okay. But and this is to the audience so that they understand why these debates are very, very necessary. This is the debate between a Thatcherite and Reagan economics. So a Thatcherite economics, Thatcher would say the first thing is let's balance the budget. So the first thing that she did is balance the budget. So that's austerity measures, increase taxes. Once you've balanced, increase indirect consumptive taxes, balance the budget. Once you've done that, then you have massive tax cuts. And that's where the growth comes from. Reagan economics is, no, let's increase the budget deficit because we've cut taxes. And we've gone into deregulation. And then once we've done that, then the economy growth will cover the deficit. But you will have an immediate deficit in the beginning. But the reason why Thatcherite couldn't do that and Reagan could do that is that Reagan had an overwhelming majority. He had the political capital to implement a wider deficit, knowing that by the time he gets to 4 years, growth would have come in. So you find that Reagan comes in, introduces tax rate, a reduction in taxes, and actually there's a depression. There's a dip, a recession in America in 81, but by 83 the economy had bounced back. Thatcherite didn't have that much leeway. So the first thing that she did was to balance the books before she went on tax cuts. And this was the fundamental difference between Sunak and Liz Truss. Liz Truss was like, let's increase the deficit, but then the markets went apoplectic. And this is the problem that Ruto is facing. In that 5 years ago, what you were discussing with the creditors happened under Kenyatta. They sat down with the creditors and they said, okay, this is what you want to do? Okay, we'll give you a lot of room. They gave him a lot of room. And guess what? Now the problem is you have a Greece problem. And Ruto is trying to avoid a Greece problem. The only problem that I see with Ruto is the political will. You need to have a significant coalition to go through an austere measure. And I think that Tendai Biti was on the ball. But because the opposition was part of the government, they couldn't go on the streets. This was their guy telling you that, you know what, you're only going to earn X amount.
Part of one of my biggest gripes then is, throughout the GNU, 90% of recurrent
guys, are you gonna eat something?
Sure. Actually, that's I've tried this. And
sure.
It's actually good.
It went to recurrent expenditure because we were pandering to the civil service instead of doing things that make business sense. So in March 2009, the civil servants were on $100 a month, and then by the time the GNU ended, they were on $500 a month. We had the best paid civil servants in SADC and Sub-Saharan Africa, which didn't make any sense. So yeah, I will always have my reservations about the way Treasury conducted its affairs during the GNU. I'm not as glowing in my assessment as you are.
Okay. I'm being told we spend too much time on these topics, but I think it's interesting because these are ideological issues, but it also tells us that economics is a much easier ball game than politics. Politics is much harder. But if you want to implement hard measures, it's always better to have a coalition or a government of national unity when everybody is part of it.
I don't know that these are hard measures. You see, I could be wrong, and I'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. I think that prosperity, economic policy that drives prosperity, isn't necessarily painful, right? So if you cut taxes and reduce regulation and you open up the economy, that does tend to reduce government revenue and increase deficits in the short term. But in the medium to short term, it's phenomenal for growth, right? And that's what you want.
You get hyperinflation. Remember, if the deficit increases, you get into high inflation. And if you get into high inflation, price increases are happening anyway. So, and this is the problem.
No, it just depends on how you fund the deficit, right? So if you print to fund the deficit, then you have high inflation, then you have...
So how are you going to fund the deficit?
Right. So
how are you going to fund the deficit?
So like Reagan did, right? He didn't have any issues. The US dollar was...
He had a lot of political power.
Yeah, but I think that...
So creditors are amenable. The recession, he didn't get punished because of the recession, because it was earlier on in his term. Mm-hmm. Right? Whereas, and that's exactly what Ruto...
This is exactly when you should bite the bullet, right?
That's what Ruto is doing. Because how you fund the deficit is you now need creditors. Mm-hmm. So the creditors are coming in and saying, oh yeah, sure, you've got a deficit, we're quite happy to fund your deficit, but we know the problems that you will have if you can't pay us back. So you're going to have to implement A, B, C, D. Those subsidies, they have to go. This has to go. This has to go. Remember, the economic malaise that Kenya is experiencing is because of Kenyatta's bad 10 years.
Yeah, but look at another economic model on the global stage that we can maybe spend 2 minutes discussing. Because
sure.
Economics is, it's universal, right? So, Argentina, South American country, they've had hyperinflation, they've had credit defaults, they've had all sorts of these very challenges that are endemic in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And Javier Milei has been president for 7 months. Right, and he's cut government spending. Inflation is already down. The outlook is good. The creditors love him. So it's doable, right? You can actually come in with libertarian economic policy, sell it to your creditors, buy time for your deficit and for your from your creditors, and then execute.
That's actually a very good example. And I think that Argentina, if you look at Javier, he's faced insurmountable problems. And that's the reason why he's doing it earlier on in his term. So, first of all, Parliament has actually rejected a lot of his deregulation laws.
Although he's managed to cut a lot of regulations.
He has, using executive order and not going through Parliament. And then the second thing is he's had unions going on the streets. Mm-hmm. It's just that he's got, a bigger constitution or a bigger following of people who support his coalition, that support the measures that he's doing, that he has been able to weather that particular storm. And that's what we're in a storm with Ruto. And the question is, can he weather it? Because Gen Z and what they've done, you have to agree. You have to admit what Gen Z has done in Kenya from a political perspective is make the right noise. to actually have a political stand. Notwithstanding that it's wrong. I disagree with what they're doing, but politically what they've done is they've given pressure to the Ruto administration. Even though Ruto has made,
I mean, it's
all
just to
over.
ignore them.
So is it
Just noise.
No.
It's just noise.
But is it completely wrong? I don't think it's completely wrong.
Okay.
I think it's just noise.
I think what this should have done to President Ruto is to at least alert him to some of the effects of his austerity. And maybe for him and his colleagues to sit around the table and say, how can we balance the two? Because these are genuine issues. You wouldn't expect any society to wake up with the price of bread being much higher than it was yesterday, and people are like celebrating. No, probably it happens in Zimbabwe. Maybe in other, but in a normal environment, people would protest, and I don't think it will change completely the path that President Ruto has taken, but I see some modification in one form or another. And like when these multilateral institutions are recommending austerity to you, I doubt they really think about some of the vulnerable members of your society, because I mean these people are not toying for expensive cars or whatever. This is like bread and butter issue. So if I am facing a scenario where I won't be able to afford bread, surely I can't just be sitting.
Okay, so Ranga,
Ranga, by the protest time and money is just gonna
no, because the hardship is a result of the policy that has been pursued. So I'm protesting so that at least the
nature of life to have hardship, sir.
No.
Okay, let's make the distinction. Botswana has never had to go through austerity measures. You go through austerity measures because there's something fundamentally wrong.
Because of the politicians. They mess up the economy.
They mess up the economy.
Yes.
And then you inherit a messed up economy.
Yes.
What do you do? Remember, again, let's make it very clear. Botswana has never had to go through austerity measures.
I think Botswana is a bad example.
What do you say Botswana is a bad example?
So, firstly, it's got a very small population. It's got a very rich natural resource endowment. No. I'm just want to give you full context. Let me finish. Yeah. Botswana was never a colony. It was a protectorate. So structurally, it's exceptional on the continent, right? Like there's almost no country like it in terms of its history over the last 150 years.
That's underestimating what Botswana has had to do.
So yeah.
Botswana was a poor country, poorer than Zimbabwe. I mean, people forget this, that Botswana 30 years ago was poorer than Zimbabwe. They had their own problems, but they never went through austerity measures because they kept to the budget. Mm-hmm. Right? And because they kept to the budget, you never have to go through austerity measures. You go through austerity measures because you're now in judicial management. Mm-hmm. To use a term that you guys are familiar with, is you're now in judicial management. And if you're in judicial management, what's the first thing that you have to go through? It's bitter medicine. This is cancer treatment. Right?
But the judicial manager can't be driving a Latest 300 series.
Well, why not?
And I think that's a fair argument.
Of the what?
That's a fair argument.
And it's being funded.
Have you seen the law around administration and judicial management of businesses? Like the revenue that the manager, how the manager's income is calculated. It's a percentage of top line. And if there's no top line, I think it's a percentage of like the
I think in politics, I think that's the messaging. And I think Ruto got that messaging wrong. What happens after judicial management? A company goes through judicial management.
It either comes out of it or it goes into liquidation.
Either it's
okay. So the
covers or
so
liquidation.
Structural adjustment programs, it's like liquidation. So judicial management is you still have control as management, but you're restricted to what you can and cannot do. And then structural adjustment program is when the creditors actually take over. When they say, you know what, actually, this is not working, and we now take over. And this is exactly what happened in Zimbabwe. People forget this. We didn't choose to go into economic structural adjustment program. We found ourselves there because we had mismanaged our economy. And Ruto, and I don't know, maybe it's the Kenyan culture. He's actually trying to avoid it. And unfortunately, the political messaging was terrible. And he has to win that back. Because yes, indeed, they've been spending on cars, they've been splurging on all sorts of things. He had to appease politically a lot of political factions within his own party. And that comes with a lot of expenditure. And then suddenly when he went to Europe or when he went to US, then he was told the hard facts that if we are your creditors and you still want our money, these are the things that you need to do. And we are asking you to do them now. If you don't do them, in 5 years' time, it's economic structural adjustment program. Anyway, let's hear what you guys actually think. It's something that's very interesting, and it comes back to Zimbabwe because these are all ideological issues. And you can see that these are the sort of debates that happen in public discourse, but also when Ministry of Finance sit and when Treasury sit. They have to discuss these things.
It's the same thing.
And, what you then implement or not implement, it then plays out in the economy. But, I'm very, very bullish on Kenya. I think that what President Ruto is doing is necessary. I'm a little bullish, not totally bullish on South Africa because we still need to see their economic policies. But as of now, they haven't printed. They've got one of the strongest central banks, and that's kudos to them.
Which is privately owned.
Which is actually privately owned. So I think that there's a lot that they still need to do, but I'm positive with South Africa. Are you positive on Kenya? Are you positive on
I'm very bullish. Unlike you, I'm not moderately bullish.
Okay,
I'm
you're
very bullish
on South Africa.
On South Africa.
Okay.
I am bearish on Kenya.
Okay.
I'm equally bullish on South Africa. I think Kenya, they are on the right path. They just need to manage it properly.
Okay.
Because
so you're mildly bullish on Kenya.
It was going to be... things were going to come to a head on some point. So it's better that they tackle it right now, but they have to get their messaging right and to make sure that they sort of moderate the austerity path that they are taking in consideration of the state of the economy and also the populace.
Yeah. Well, let us know what you think. Are you bullish on Kenya? Do you think that Kenya is on the right path? Do you think that South Africa is on the right path? And let's share ideas. Don't take our opinions very seriously. We're just guys being funded by pro brands with Revive, which is fantastic.
I don't know what they've put in there.
And
it's actually quite
in
nice.
the orange fruit.
I love it.
It is, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. How was your wine?
Yes.
This is good.
Okay.
What you almost done with the bottle?
No.
The entire bottle.
It's more than half.
It's just been an hour. Yeah, it's more than half. It's that good.
That's good.
So thanks to Menashe
and Asherai Distributors
and
Mike and his team at Pro Brands. Thank you guys so much for
we appreciate it,
sponsoring lovely snacks. We appreciate the love.
Cheers. Enjoy your weekend.